getting on. This section is entitled Luke, the third Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles. Well, last session we wallowed in the Christian writings that have survived for us from the latter years of the first and early second centuries. But we left the writings of the third Gospel and its sequel, the Acts of the Apostles, to be considered separately. Tradition claims that the author... Start again.
Hello. Sorry, we'll start again. Well, good afternoon, everyone. To all of you here and all of you who are watching online. We've reached session 42, getting towards the end of our long Bible story. This one is entitled Luke's Contribution to the New Testament with his Gospel and the Acts. Well, last session, we wallowed in the Christian writings that have survived for us from the latter years of the first and early second centuries. But we left the writings of the third Gospel and its sequel, the Acts, to be considered separately. And that's our task today. Well, tradition claims that the author of the Gospel was Luke, but there's no corroborating evidence for this, so Luke it will have to be for us. Tradition also claims that he was another native of Antioch. And if that is so, he may well have known Matthew's Gospel. But he was not a Jew. He was a very well-educated Gentile Christian, and many people think he had been a travelling companion of Paul. And they think that because of the passages in the Acts which describe that we did this and we went there and we went somewhere else. And if that is historically true, and it's a big if, it's obvious that he admired Paul but didn't really understand his theology. But that could have been because he'd never read Paul's letters, which were not collected together from the places that had received them until the year 90. Well, some people think Luke was the beloved physician, and that's because of his correct use of medical terms. But even this is now doubtful, as many other writers could do the same. Some people claim he attended Mary and listened to her story before writing his birth narratives of Jesus. But this is fanciful, and now also discredited, I'm afraid, because this picture of Mary does not connect with the woman as portrayed as the mother of Jesus in her later years that we find in the Gospel. Well, some people, particularly in the Orthodox churches, think that Luke was an artist who even painted an icon of Mary. And more than once on our travels, Brian and I have been allowed a tiny glimpse of very aged icons, said to be copies of the original by Luke. Orthodox Christians do not question traditions as we Westerners have been made to do. But on one occasion, a young monk grinned at us and said cheekily, "Well, anyway, it brings in the tourists." Well, Luke, let's have a picture of him. An icon. What is without doubt, however, is that Luke is the author of two of the longest books in the New Testament. He was indeed a consummate artist in his literary style. His prologue to the Gospel has been claimed to be the most perfectly constructed sentence in the Greek language of the first century. It takes up all 5 verses at the beginning of chapter 1, one long, well-constructed sentence. All that before the narrative begins. And in fact, the scholars agree that he is the most sophisticated writer in the whole of the Bible. So, all credit to him. We may ask, why did he write 2 books rather than one very long one? And the answer? Well, he was writing just a few years before codex books became known, which enabled writing to be done on 2 sides of each page. And therefore Luke's stories were still written on one side only, on sheets of either papyrus or vellum, which were then sewn together and rolled up into a scroll in long time-honoured fashion. Each of his 2 books would have been 10 yards long. So 2 books, not one. But in the New Testament, Luke's books are sadly separated from each other by the placing of the 4th Gospel in between them. And that's for the sake of putting all the Gospels first and then the stories of the early church. There's no doubt, though, that the 2 belong together. The prologue, both to the Gospel and to the Acts, is addressed to the same Theophilus, who is described as most excellent, and therefore a person of high repute, who has already heard much and is now to be further enlightened. But who was he? Answer: we do not know. He might have been a real person who could have passed on all his knowledge about the new religion to others high up in the Roman government. On the other hand, Theophilus could have been a literary invention for the benefit of style. In Greek, Theo means God, and Philos means lover. So Theophilus, God lover. You must decide for yourselves which you prefer. It is noticeable throughout these 2 books, though, that Luke's aim was to present Christianity to Rome as nothing to be feared by them. This is very important all the way through his 2 books. The Gospel begins with linking the birth of Jesus with the reign of Caesar Augustus, whose birth, on the 25th of December, was hailed as that of a son of God. Augustus is hailed as establishing the Pax Romana, while in the Gospel the angels sang at the birth of Jesus of peace coming to the earth. Historically, though, I'm afraid there was no universal census, which we hear about in Luke. And Quirinius was not governor of Syria until the year 6. But Luke uses this device very cleverly to suggest that the Romans themselves had enabled Jesus to be born in Bethlehem, the city of David. And twice in the Gospel, Roman centurions are described very honourably. Once in chapter 7 as a man of compassion and humility, concerned for the welfare of his slave. And the other one after the death of Jesus. Even later, when writing of the Roman Pontius Pilate, Luke describes his 3 attempts to prevent Jesus from suffering the death penalty, whereas in reality, Pilate would certainly not have bothered. Luke could not deny that the cross was a Roman death, but he softened its impact by describing Jesus fully in control of all those events. And this style is again seen in Acts, when Paul was in trouble, for example. And Luke slipped in subtle compliments into his text, a hint of flattery between commas, as in chapter 13, where he wrote, "The proconsul Sergius Paulus, comma, an intelligent man, comma, believed," and we're carried on. Just little things like this are fun to notice. And then at Philippi, Paul was given a Roman apology for the treatment he'd received after he disclosed that he himself was a Roman citizen. And Luke also told us that Paul's life had been saved by the Romans when a lynch mob of Jews had hoped to kill him on his way to Jerusalem. That's in chapter 21. Well, another important characteristic feature running through both of Luke's books is the constant emphasis that everything was the result of the Holy Spirit at work. And if you're accustomed to making notes in your personal Bibles, then I'd suggest you try underlining every time the Holy Spirit is mentioned in the Gospel and in the Acts. They are woven into the text, and you will be surprised how many times you find them. The Spirit was guiding all the work of Jesus himself, and later the church in its formative years. In fact, an alternative title for the combined books is the Gospel of the Holy Spirit. You can't read those two books without constantly reading of the Spirit. Take note, because it's a characteristic of this Gospel. But you are likely to be upset when you read of Luke's intention to investigate everything from the very first and write an orderly account. And you think you'll be reading reliable history, as in our more enlightened times. And then you find yourself reading about angels. Angels? Angels, I'm sorry to say, do not appear in our history books. So we have a dichotomy there. Scholarly opinion nowadays admits that Luke's systematic story is neither historical nor chronological in order, but that his scheme has laid out events in their order of importance. Quite different. And it was the German scholar Hans Conzelmann in the 1960s coined the term salvation history to define Luke's system. For example, Luke's story of the conversion of Paul in the Acts is so important that Luke has placed it much too early in the story of the Jerusalem church. And then in telling of the events in Antioch, again, he softens the bitter row between Paul and Peter so that it doesn't seem to matter very much. But now, let's have a look at the Gospel. There's the Lindisfarne Gospel depiction of Luke, the Gospel writer. Lindisfarne Gospels are in the British Library in London. If you're ever there and want to go and see them, they're on permanent display. Unless, of course, they've been loaned out, but that's not very often. And that is the open page. This is a codex, writing on both sides. There's a carpet page on the left, and the beginning of Luke's Gospel on the right, the Quoniam Cuidae page. It's beautiful, particularly when you see close up and you see all the little Celtic animals prowling around in between the letters. The children I taught at school loved the lesson that they were allowed to use a page of their notebooks for their homework, put their own initial and illustrate it Celtic style. It is beautiful. Anyway, we're not into the Lindisfarne Gospels. Luke's Gospel then. Can you find Mark's washing line structure in Luke's Gospel? Remember the washing line? In Mark's Gospel, 2 firm posts at each end, and the heavy weight that nearly breaks being supported in the middle, the crisis point, by a prop. Do you remember that? And 2 sessions each side of the prop. The Mark's washing line scheme. The answer is yes. We found it in Matthew's Gospel, and now we can find the same structure in Luke's Gospel. He's put the teachings of Jesus, there's one exception. In Mark's second section, all the teachings of Jesus, which happened in a house in Capernaum, Luke has transformed to the event of a long, slow journey to Jerusalem. So, a stylistic difference. Like Mark, Luke's story of Jesus' public ministry, though, begins with his baptism, although there's no hint in Luke's account that Jesus and John the Baptist were cousins. Curious, isn't it? Well, before continuing, Luke inserted a connecting Jesus' ministry into the reign of Emperor Tiberius. And then he gives his own genealogical tree for Jesus. Unlike Matthew, Luke traces Jesus further back, further than Abraham, to the universal first man of all people, Adam. Unlike Mark and Matthew, though, Luke's first story describes the rejection of Jesus in the synagogue at Nazareth. The very important story first, you note, setting the scene for the ultimate rejection of Jesus by the Jews. Then he describes Jesus as a healer of various infirmities, which attracted a lot of popular interest among the people, until he raised a very big question as he healed the paralyzed man who'd been let down through the roof on his bed. Jesus pronounced his sins were forgiven. And the Pharisees were alarmed, quite rightly so, saying it was only God who could do that. They were amazed, however, when Jesus' words proved effective, and the man did get up and walk, completely healed. It was a positive clue, this early stage, to Jesus' real identity. Luke included several of Jesus' teaching parables here, just as in Mark's Gospel, and then stories of the challenges he faced when apparently breaking the Sabbath day prohibitions. He healed a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath day and in the synagogue, in front of all who were there. Jesus dumbfounded the righteous scribes and Pharisees with his questions concerning right and wrong, good or evil, and left them embarrassed by their own convictions and angry when he healed the man's hand. This was a big contrast to a later event when the enlightened Roman centurion, no less, had humbly appealed for help and healing for one of his slaves. The conversation between him and Jesus is remarkable. It concerns a mutual understanding of authority. And the centurion evoked Jesus' admiration when he said, "Not even in Israel have I found such faith." But the ultimate authority of Jesus is displayed in the next story, which is also unique in Luke's Gospel, when he met the funeral procession of a widow's only son in the village of Nain. Jesus was filled with compassion for the widow and demonstrated his authority when he brought the boy back to life again, a hint of God's authority which would resonate in his own future resurrection. Other stories, like his stilling of the storm, aroused questions of his true authority among the disciples, and the raising of Jairus' daughter, again from Mark's story, endorsed the issue that really mattered. Death was not the ultimate authority in life. Quite a big impression to make. Well, the Markan scheme is prominent again in the crisis sequence of the Gospel, which started with the feeding of the 5,000 people, which drove Jesus to take his disciples away for a while, except that Luke makes no mention of going northwards to Caesarea Philippi. We're left with the impression that it all happened in Israel. Well, Peter's confession was there, that Jesus is the Messiah of God, and 8 days later he describes the Transfiguration, but with differing details. Luke then stylistically, as we noted before, puts all Jesus' teachings into the long, slow journey towards Jerusalem for his account of the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. He interspersed the teaching with some of his much-loved parables: the Good Samaritan, the lost sheep, the prodigal son, the unjust steward, the rich man and Lazarus, the 10 lepers, the Pharisee and the publican, all of which are from his own unique sources, until they all drew near to Jerusalem. The stories of the blind man who was unable to see clearly and the transformation of the tax collector Zacchaeus set the scene for the remarkable events that followed. Luke again follows Mark's outline of events, but adds several things that are unique to his own account of the Passion narratives. The most notable difference occurs in Luke's account of the Last Supper, when Jesus took the cup of wine first and blessed it before the bread, a sequence, as we noted last time, described in the Didache, which taught how to celebrate the Eucharist. Well, nowadays, of course, we follow the sequence described by Paul in his letter to the Corinthians, presuming that that was earlier. But Paul is noted for not having much to do with the Christian community in Antioch and may not have been aware of their preferred order. Who knows? Which one was earlier? Does it really matter? Well, Luke's sensitivity to the Romans has altered Mark's stark thrust of Jesus' sufferings and death and softened them, as we noted earlier. Luke portrays Jesus as serene and in control of what was happening to him, even healing the ear of the high priest's slave during his arrest in Gethsemane. And later, when Peter had denied knowing Jesus in the high priest's courtyard, Luke wrote the poignant comment of the dignified Jesus. The Lord turned and looked at Peter. The biggest difference in Luke's account of the Passion, however, is the lack of any mention of the Jewish trial, as in Mark. He describes only the one in front of the Roman procurator Pilate, who perhaps, you can sense with some relief, wrote Luke, sent Jesus to the Jewish King Herod to be dealt with. In spite of Pilate's uncharacteristic efforts to find Jesus not guilty of the Jewish crimes of which he was accused, Luke still describes Pilate's condemnation of Jesus only to be flogged, but eventually having to give way to the demands of the Jewish crowds to do as they wished to him. So all the way through, he's trying to exonerate the Romans. But far from being an instrument of painful torture, the cross in Luke's version becomes a pulpit. A very dignified Jesus forgave the penitent thief and told him he would soon be in paradise. And finally he prayed, "Father, into your hands," and calmly breathed his last. A pious death, and a great example to be followed by others when persecuted. Notably, of course, Stephen in the Acts of the Apostles. This is very different from Mark's account, but it is Luke's prelude to the culminating triumph of the resurrection. Luke presents the risen Jesus much more positively than either Mark or Matthew. It is the absolute climax to his story. The walk to Emmaus is presented very physically, another long walk, with plenty of time to encapsulate all the Old Testament messages of the prophets down the ages, culminating at the supper to which he was invited and recognized for who he is, always now present in the breaking of the Eucharistic bread. Yes, Luke did follow Mark's outline, but enriched it with his own material and his own distinctive presentation. Very importantly, I want to add a curious part when the disciples from Emmaus had run back to Jerusalem to tell the disciples that they had seen the risen Jesus, only to be told, oh yes, he appeared to Peter this afternoon. We can only guess what they talked about. But then Jesus showed them his hands and his feet and urged them to touch him, because in the time of Luke, people were already being rather skeptic about this mystery of the resurrection. Perhaps it was only a ghost, they said. Well, Jesus said in this appearance in front of the disciples, touch me, feel me, I'm no ghost. And then he scotched another rumour. Perhaps Jesus was only an angel appearing. So what did Jesus do? He asked them if they'd got anything to eat. Strange, until you know your Bible. Way back in the book of Judges, there was an angel who came to be active in Israel. But perhaps you will remember when we were looking at the stories in the Apocrypha, we looked at the story of Tobias. Tobias, who was accompanied by an angel in disguise. And every time, it came through at the end of the story of Tobias, that every time Tobias was going to sit down to eat, the angel left the room to give the dog a walk, or something like that. He was never present when Tobias and people ate. In the upper room, Jesus said, have you got anything for me to eat? And he took a piece of bread and fish and ate it in front of them, proving to Jews he was no angel any more than he was not a ghost. Very important. And unless you know the story of Tobias and the book of Judges well, you'll miss the association. But it was very, very prominent in all the wisdom literature that we've studied recently. Well, we cannot leave this wonderful gospel without first looking at the distinctive birth narratives. They take up the first 2 chapters of this gospel. They're well loved by all Christians, full of joy and wonder, creating an attractive introduction to the whole gospel, while furnishing Christians all through the ages with canticles that are sung daily in Christian worship. But they too also have a distinctive message to proclaim when examined carefully. The first thing to note is these 2 chapters are totally Jewish in style, unlike the rest of the gospel. They draw on material and motifs from the Old Testament. They bind Jesus firmly into the Jewish tradition, and through close family ties, not only to the future mission of John Baptist, but also through his father Zechariah, to the full temple tradition of Jerusalem. So there is Jesus absolutely in the heart of Judaism from the very beginning. His story of the visitation between the 2 mothers-to-be not only endorses the close connection between their 2 sons, but also very firmly asserts the priority of the one above the other. Question: was it Mary or was it Elizabeth who sang, "My soul magnifies the Lord"? The earliest manuscript that survives does not give us a name. It merely says, "And she said." But it's very reminiscent of Hannah's song when she gave Samuel, the son of her old age, to serve God in his temple. Elizabeth or Mary, it doesn't matter. It's a powerful song of confidence in what God will achieve in the future. The birth story of John is unique, and its very public atmosphere is in complete contrast to Luke's portrayal of the birth of Jesus. But Luke, as you know by now, wished the Gentiles to feel an affinity with his story from the very beginning. The Annunciation by Gabriel to a virgin named Mary, and her submissive willingness to cooperate with God, is an example of this. It has provoked much debate over the years as people have read it at face value, or even as a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. But they miss Luke's message. The so-called virgin birth doctrine is not so much a scientific truth, so much as a theological truth, and certainly not necessary for salvation. The resurrection is. But Luke's Gentile readers would have recognized motifs of Mount Olympus in the mention of a virgin, and felt very comfortable with Luke's story about Jesus. This Jesus would be as important for them as for the Jews. Luke draws all readers into his story very cleverly, as all good storytellers do, giving them mere hints and leaving them to fill out the details of the story imaginatively for themselves, as we continue to do today. Quote, "She laid him in a manger, for there was no room at the inn." And that's all that Luke wrote. The rest we elaborate for ourselves, as did the medieval people in this country when creating their mystery plays, which were the forerunners of all the popular nativity plays we see in schools and churches today. I don't know if you've ever seen the mystery plays, but this is a modern portrayal of the medieval mystery play of York. You can see it was on a platform with actors, and in the medieval years, that would have been on a cart drawn by a donkey or a horse. And it would have trailed from place to place to place, telling one story out of the whole lot. And there would have been lots and lots and lots of different carts telling the rest of the stories. And this is the modern version in York today. On a cart, see the wheels underneath it, the steps going up for the actors to take their places, and just one scene would be played out on this particular cart. That's an example of medieval plays. Quietly and unobserved one night, Jesus was born in Bethlehem, the city of the shepherd boy who long ago had been anointed by the prophet Samuel to become the great King David, no less. And now the first visitors to the new baby, summoned by angelic visions and songs of great joy, were no less than the shepherds of Bethlehem. Jewish in character, it certainly is. But the angel's song was to include all others, not only the Jews. "I am bringing you good news of great joy," sang Gabriel, "for all people." Well, Luke's Jewish story continues with a mere mention of the circumcision, but in greater detail 6 weeks later, after the birth of Jesus, recording his first visit to the temple. Again, in accordance with Jewish tradition, for his mother to be purified after childbirth, and for him to be presented to the Lord as a sacrifice, being the firstborn son, but then redeemed with an offering. And in the case of Jesus, the offering was that of a poor family, 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, as specified in the law of Leviticus. It also involved paying 5 shekels to the priest. But Luke doesn't mention this. 2 people in the temple that day did recognize the significance of the young Jesus. Old Simeon rejoiced that the child would grow and become a light for the Gentiles as well as the glory of Israel. And devout Anna also recognized in the child the future redemption of Israel. And after all this, the story of Jesus again at Jerusalem, now aged 12, was this his bar mitzvah, we ask, is almost anti-climax in character. The young Jesus had found the Pharisees' school in the temple, where he listened and asked questions of the teachers, who were amazed at his understanding. Another credit to that unknown rabbi in the synagogue of Nazareth. Then, as a stylistic bridge to the future, Luke wrote, Jesus increased in wisdom and in years before Luke began to use the Gospel of Mark for his story outline. Well, so much for our brief look at Luke's Gospel. But I must now introduce you to one of the major questions that have absorbed scholars over the centuries. It's known as the synoptic problem. The word synoptic being used to describe the 3 Gospels, which all present the same outline of the story of Jesus, in contrast to the 4th Gospel, which is quite different. It's not Mark's outline that's the problem, but surprisingly, identical passages in Matthew and Luke which are not found in Mark. Where did they come from? Well, the first question contradicts what I said 2 sessions ago about Matthew's Gospel, saying that it had all been written by a single author. It's now obvious that he, like Luke, must have used another source or even sources, because they have both in many places written sentences which are identical. 200 verses, word for word, and that cannot be an accident. This material mainly concerns several sayings of Jesus, such as the Beatitudes, the Golden Rule, the Lord's Prayer, and a few of Jesus' parables, the wedding feast and the talents, for example. But another question, which has been debated over the last 2 to 3 centuries, speculates on the source of this shared material. Some people thought it might have been an early list of Jesus' sayings in Aramaic as an aide-memoire for the first missionaries, like the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas. Have you come across that? It's an ancient document which was found in Egypt in 1945 at Nag Hammadi. Look it up in Google if you're interested. It has a lot of pithy sayings, one after the other, some of which could well have come from Jesus, others perhaps a bit more questionable. But it's interesting to see and why people thought that this unknown source of material could have been as just a list of short sayings of Jesus. But a closer look, as I had to do many years ago, showed that the copied text had not been in Aramaic, but in Greek, letter by letter the same. And I spent many an hour underlining letters in Greek in 3 different Gospels, or 2 different Gospels. I've forgotten all about it now, and I've given the book away. So, not by Aramaic, the speculation continues even now. What was this other source? Some scholars are convinced of its reality, and they refer to it now by the letter Q, from the German word Quelle, which means a source. They claim that they have reconstructed it and found it to be in the traditional wisdom style of teaching. Others, however, have completely dismissed the whole idea of Q because No mention of such a document has ever been found, well, so far at least, in any other early Christian writings, of which we do have quite a lot. But for those of you who are interested, I've copied out 2 pages of parallel passages in English to help you, and you can see for yourselves why people have found all this so interesting. I have to confess, I don't, but people do. The first one, you can't see it very clearly there, but you can pick up the sheets from the table. The parallels in Mark, copied by Matthew and Luke. So all 3 tell the same stories. The second one, things that are absolutely word for word the same in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. So this is the question. And the answer Q may be the answer to the question. Well, I've included all this, not so much for its importance for faith, but because you need to be aware of such debates when you meet these questions studying the Bible in your house groups. If you hear of the synoptic problem, or who copied from whom, or anything about the Gospel Q, this is what it's all about. And you can get interested, or like me, dismiss it if you wish. Well, it's time to stop. Next time, we're going to take a closer look at Luke's sequel, the Acts of the Apostles. And that'll be in 2 weeks' time, on Sunday, 19th of November, at 4:30 as usual. And I look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you for coming. I hope you've enjoyed it. And do pick up the notes if you haven't done it already from the table. Goodbye.